All right. Today we're continuing in the book of Be Authentic, and in the Bible book Genesis, we're going to cover chapters 46 through 48. Wiersbe titles this section "Grandfather Knows Best." That's for the last part where Jacob knows better than even Joseph how things are going to happen. And so let's set the scene then, as usual. So last week Joseph tested his brothers for final time by framing Benjamin with a theft to see how they would react to that. The brothers confessed their long ago sin against Joseph, their brother. They confessed it to Joseph, their brother, but they didn't know it was he. And then Judah offered to replace Benjamin himself as for Benjamin as Joseph's slave. He almost begged to, and Joseph, that was the last thing Joseph needed to see. He revealed his true identity. He asked his family to come live in Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and the brothers reconciled. It was a beautiful thing. And then the 11 brothers returned to Canaan. They told Jacob all about it. Jacob was astounded to learn that Joseph was still alive. Somehow he didn't have a heart attack and kept going. And so now he's 130 years old. And during those years, he had learned many important lessons about God and himself and other people, especially his sons. So now, thanks to God's goodness and Joseph's faithfulness, Jacob would reap a rich harvest in Egypt during the next 17 years. His closing years wouldn't bring winter with its cold and storms. Jacob's sunset years would be like autumn with warm golden sunshine and peace and bounties of God's gracious harvest. So we're going to make a pilgrimage down to Egypt. So let's look at the where we'll be headed. So this is the map of the area. We've seen something like very similar to this before, but I wanted to emphasize now that as we start the scene, we're in Hebron. That's where Jacob was when we're for a time. He was up at Bethel. God wanted him to be there, and then God had him go down to Hebron, and he was living there, and he was going to make his way to Egypt. The old man and his big, as we'll see, his big caravan of people and animals and everything. On the way, they'll go through Beersheba. It's kind of small. I hope you can see it. And then onward from there. So that's the scene. And we're going to now start with Genesis 46. We're going to work our way through verses 1 through 30 in this first part. That is called a pilgrim's confidence. So just to step back, most old people that I've known, including Jacob, don't like change. I'm kind of getting that way myself here. We resist change. You get used to things the way they are. But he'd lived with his family in Hebron for many years, and now the time had come to move. And a lot of us have to go through such a thing as well. So let's start with Genesis 46, verses 1 through 4, where we read, "So Jacob set out for Egypt with all his possessions, and when he came to Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to God, his father, the God of his father Isaac. And during the night, God spoke to him in a vision. 'Jacob, Jacob,' he called. 'Here I am,' Jacob replied. I am God, the God of your father, the voice said. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make your family into a great nation. I will go with you down to Egypt, and I will bring you back again. You will die in Egypt, but Joseph will be with you to close your eyes. Well, apparently, according to God, and I trust what God says, uh, Jacob was scared to go down, like I just said, and so, well, nevertheless, Jacob and his family had already left Hebron and traveled for about a week. Wiersbe thinks it'd be about a week until they came to Beersheba. Beersheba is pretty much the southernmost town in Canaan, as I just showed. And it was there Abraham had dug a well years ago. And sometimes Abraham had lived there. Isaac had also resided at Beersheba. And it was from the home in Beersheba, living with Isaac, Jacob left. That's where he was living when he left to go to Padam Aram to find a wife. So let's go back to this map. So he left Beersheba down here and went all the way to Padam Aram to Haran. You see, kind of see the scale here. So quite a voyage to find his wife and Rachel, and also picked up 3 others on the way, but that's that we've been through that, and so Rachel and Leah and everybody. So at Beersheba also, God had appeared to Hagar and spoken to her and to Isaac, and now he would appear to Jacob.
Ralph, I don't know if you can fix it or if you are even aware of it. I'm sure you're not aware of it. But for some reason, there's a large out of focus square on top of everything, on top of about half of.
Oh, there is. Oh, okay. Yes, I can fix that. Thank you. Let me go ahead and pause the recording. If I can do that. Okay. Thank you, Larry. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Let's see. I was in let me start over with verse 46, verse 1 then. So Jacob set out for Egypt with all his possessions, and he came to Beersheba, and he offered sacrifices to God, his father Isaac. During the night, God spoke to him in a vision, Jacob, Jacob, here I am. And so we read that. I will go down and bring you back again. So we were talking about all the idols, altars, not idols, altars in that Jacob's ancestors had built. So now Jacob naturally paused to build an altar and worship God, the Lord as well. It's good. A takeaway for us that it's always good to ask for God's blessing when entering a new life phase. Perhaps Jacob was fearful because he remembered that his grandfather Abraham had gotten into trouble by going down to Egypt. Abraham didn't ask for God's guidance, and when Jacob's father Isaac started to go to Egypt, the Lord stopped him. I don't know if you remember that, but in Genesis 26, 1 through 2, let's just refresh. A severe famine now struck the land as it happened before in Abraham's time. Now, this is in Isaac's time, not Jacob's. So famines come and go in this land. And so this is not the current famine. It was an earlier one. So Isaac moved to Gerar, where Abimelech, king of Philistines, lived. The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, do not go down to Egypt, but do as I tell you. All right. So that was Isaac. And so God stopped him from that. So it was natural for Jacob to have built that altar and ask for what the Lord wants him to do. But that then, amazingly, the Lord came to Jacob at night and assured him that relocating would be safe for him and his family. God's words, Jacob, Jacob. You know, when somebody in Hebrew, when somebody repeated the name, it meant, let me get your attention. And so God was really wanting to get Jacob's attention. And that reminds us that for us, that the Lord knows our names just as much well as he knows Jacob's. And he also knows our personal needs just as well as he knew Jacob's. Let's look at some verses to remind us of that important fact. Let's look into the book of John. Some quotes from Jesus. John 10, verse 3. The gate opens the gate for him, and the sheep recognize his voice and come to him. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. Now, he is God, and we are the sheep. He knows us by name. I am the good shepherd, Jesus said. I know my own sheep, and they know me. And then finally, in verse 27, my sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow me. God knows you. And God wanted to remind Jacob that he was the Lord of all the earth, including Egypt. Jacob had nothing to fear because the Lord would keep his promises he had made to him at Bethel. In Bethel, that's where we have Jacob's Jacob's ladder scene was, and that's where he saw that vision. And in Bethel, he said, I am with you and I will protect you wherever you go. God also reassured him that he would multiply Jacob's descendants and make them into a great nation. He said that earlier. He said it again. And then God gave Jacob the added assurance that he would die in Egypt and that his son Joseph would see to it that his body would be brought back to Canaan and buried in the cave of Machpelah. We'll see in a minute, where Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah and Leah had been buried. With these promises, Jacob left Canaan and moved to Egypt. Okay, so that was God's promise. Now let's move to God's blessing in verses 46, 5 through 27. So Jacob left Beersheba, and his sons took him to Egypt. They carried him and their little ones and their wives in the wagons that Pharaoh had provided for them. They also took all their livestock and all their personal belongings they had acquired in the land of Canaan. So Jacob and his entire family went to Egypt, sons and grandsons, daughters and granddaughters, and all his descendants. Normally that would be a pretty dangerous trip to make, but I suppose with such a mob of people, nobody's going to probably try to attack them for that. They probably had some swords and things too as well. So anyway, these are the names of the descendants of Israel, the sons of Jacob who went to Egypt. Now we go through a long list of names, and we start with. And for this, I'm going to show you our good old chart here. And we can go, we're going to go through all the sons of Leah, and then Zilpah, and then Rachel, and then Bilhah. So I'll read it quickly, but we'll start with Reuben here, number 1. So Reuben was Jacob's oldest son. The sons of Reuben were Hanok, Palu, Hezron, and Carmi. The sons of Simeon, were Jamin, Ohad, Jachin, Zohar, Shaul. Shaul's mother was a Canaanite woman. The sons of Levi were Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. You hear a lot more about those three later. The sons of Judah were Onan, Shelah, Perez, Zerah, though and Onan had died in the land of Canaan. The sons of Perez were Hezron and Hamul. And then the descendants of Perez included David and Jesus. The sons of Issachar, okay, moving down to the ninth one born, but also of Leah. The sons of Issachar were Tola, Pua, Jasub, and Shimron. The sons of Zebulun were Sered, Elon, and Jalil. The sons of Leah, okay, so the sons of Leah and Jacob were born in Padam Aram, in addition to their daughter Dinah, and the number of Jacob's descendants, male and female, through Leah was 33. The sons of Gad were Zephon, Haggai, Shuni, Esbon, Eri, Arodi, and Areli. The sons of Asher were Imnah, Ishvi, and Beriah. Their sister was Sarah. Beriah's sons were Heber and Malchiel. Okay. The sons of Zilpah, the servant to Leah by her father Laban. These were the sons of Zilpah. The number of Jacob's descendants through Zilpah were 16. The sons of Jacob's wife Rachel were Joseph and Benjamin. Joseph's sons born in the land of Egypt were Manasseh and Ephraim. Their mother was Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, the priest of On. Benjamin's sons were Bela, Becher, Eshbel, Jerah, Naaman, Ehi, Rosh, Muppin, Huppin, and Ard. Okay. The sons of Rachel. These were the sons of Rachel and Jacob. The number of Jacob's descendants through Rachel was 14. The sons of Dan the son of Dan was Husham. The sons of Naphtali were Jazreel, Guni, Jezer, and Shillam. These were the sons of Bilhah, the servant given to Rachel by her father Laban. The number of Jacob's descendants through Bilhah was 7. The total number of Jacob's direct descendants who went with him to Egypt, not counting his sons and wives, was 66. In addition, Joseph had 2 sons who were born in Egypt. So altogether, there were 70 members of his family in the land of Egypt. All right. So Pharaoh had told them, recall, going back to the beginning of this, is that they loaded up all their possessions and everything they owned. Well, Pharaoh had told them not to bother to bring their possessions since the wealth of all Egypt was at their disposal. That was last week, but it would have been really cruel to abandon their livestock, and they brought a bunch of personal possessions that they treasured. Well, still, it was not that big, 70 people. That little band of migrants would eventually bless the entire world because they would become the children, their descendants would become the nation of Israel. So this record lists first the sons, daughter, and grandson of Leah, then Zilpah, then Rachel and Bilhah, and a total of 70 people. Jacob's descendants would become as numberless, though, as the sand of the sea and the stars of heaven. God's goodness is the next topic. Moving back to our little outline here. And here, we're going to talk about God's goodness, and that's why I have this little picture of Abraham. He's building the altar, and we're going to see how God blessed him. So let's read Genesis 46, 28 through 30. As they neared their destination, Jacob sent Judah ahead to meet Joseph and get directions to the region of Goshen. And when they finally arrived there, Joseph prepared his chariot and traveled to Goshen to meet his father Jacob. When Joseph arrived, he embraced his father and wept, holding him for a long time. Finally, Jacob said to Joseph, "Now I'm ready to die, since I have seen your face again and know you're still alive." So Jacob would finally reunite with Joseph after a separation of 22 years. And Jacob chose Judah note to be their guide. So that indicates that he was now trusting Judah. Jacob could see the hand of God in all that happened. And as far as Judah goes, despite his failures, he had proved himself to be faithful in his later years, and his descendants were eventually named the royal tribe. It's in Genesis 49, 8-12. Well, I'll tell you what, we'll read that next week, because that's going to be. But Judah, when Jacob predicts and prophesies about all of his sons, he says that your brothers will praise you and grasp your enemies. And skipping down, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from his descendants, until the coming of the one to whom it belongs, the one whom all nations will honor. Okay, so that's what's going to be happening with Judah's family. So this land of Goshen was located to the north, in the northeast part of the Nile Delta area. And that's about 900 square miles, very fertile, excellent for grazing cattle. And Joseph and his father met each other there, waiting, Joseph waiting in his royal chariot, and Jacob riding in one of those wagons that Pharaoh had provided. And for the fifth time, Joseph wept. Jacob's statement in that final verse 30, "Now I'm ready to die, since I've seen your face again and know you're still alive." It can remind us of Simeon's words when he beheld the infant Jesus. Now, this isn't the tribe of Simeon. This is the man Simeon, who was the priest. Who was someone who, when Jesus was born in just a little infant, and they brought him to be circumcised, Simeon was there, and he said, "Sovereign Lord, let your servant die in peace, as you have promised. I've seen your salvation." He said that when he saw Jesus. Joseph's dreams had all come true. Now it was time to share the joys and sorrows of life with his extended family in his old age. And that takes us to, now we go through a whole section there with Pharaoh. And that begins in Genesis 46, verses 31. And it takes us to 47, verse 27. This is a quick intro. It was important for Joseph's family to be officially presented to Pharaoh's court, because they were these, resident aliens in Egypt. And even though, Pharaoh invited them, that was still a formality that would be proper for them to do, and they did. So let's look at those verses, discuss their time in front of Pharaoh here. And Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's entire family, "I will go to Pharaoh and tell him, my brothers and my father's entire family have come to me from the land of Canaan. These men are shepherds, and they raise livestock. They have brought with them their flocks and their herds and everything they said." Then he said, When Pharaoh calls for you and asks you about your occupation, you must tell him, we, your servants, have raised livestock all our lives, and our ancestors, as our ancestors have always done. When you tell him this, he will let you live here in the region of Goshen, for the Egyptians despise shepherds. So then Joseph went to see Pharaoh and told him, my father and my brothers have arrived from the land of Canaan. They have come with all their flocks and herds and possessions, and they are now in the region of Goshen. Joseph took 5 of his brothers with him and presented them to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh asked the brothers, what is your occupation? They replied, we, your servants, are shepherds just like our ancestors. We have come to live here in Egypt for a while, and there's no pasture for our flocks in Canaan. The famine is very severe, so please, we request permission to live in the region of Goshen. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, now that your father and brothers have joined you here, choose any place in the entire land of Egypt for them to live. Give them the best land of Egypt. Let them live in the region of Goshen. And if any of them have any special skills, put them in charge of my livestock too. Well, it was important for them to be introduced, and they were. And now Joseph, noticed that Joseph briefed them before they were going to meet this mighty Pharaoh. And they was, be careful now. It's not, shepherds, calling yourself a shepherd with flocks, and it's not, you don't want to emphasize that aspect of it. You've got cattle to emphasize that. So knowing, because he knew they were prejudiced against shepherd, so he wanted them to emphasize those herds of cattle and not the flocks of sheep. However, I guess they said decided they wouldn't lie, so they didn't do that, and they didn't lie about their occupation, but were honest and above board in all their dealings with Pharaoh. Turns out Pharaoh wasn't upset. He kept his promises and gave them the best of the land for their families and their flocks and their herds. And he even requested that they care for his herds as well. So one day, these 11 sons of Jacob are ordinary resident aliens, not even citizens in the land. The next day, they were invited to be Pharaoh's official herdsmen. So Joseph had been a blessing to Pharaoh, and now Pharaoh would show his gratitude, because Joseph had done amazing things for Pharaoh through the years. Okay, and then the next section is Pharaoh and Joseph's father, and that's in Genesis 47, verses 7 through 10. Genesis 47, just the next verses down. Then Joseph brought his father, Jacob, and presented him to Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. How old are you? Pharaoh asked him. Jacob replied, I have traveled this earth for 130 hard years, but my life has been short compared to the lives of my ancestors. Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh again before leaving his court. So, Pharaoh was probably happy to meet this old man, the father of Joseph, who'd done so much and meant so much to him, second in command, and just really made him successful as well. So the very first thing Jacob did was to bless Pharaoh in the name of his God, and also bless Pharaoh at the close of their interview there. In this, Jacob was an excellent example of how we as believers are to relate to those outside the faith, outside the family of God. Despite his past failings, Jacob brought God's blessing wherever he went. And despite our past failings, we can do the same. That's what we should remember out of this. My life has been short, Jacob told Pharaoh, even though he's 130 years old. His life had been hard, but it would end with 17 years of peace and happiness. Now we go to Pharaoh and Joseph's people. And that's in the next verses. It'll take us through verse 47, verse 27. So Joseph assigned the best land of Egypt, the region of Ramesses, to his father and brother, and he settled them there just as Pharaoh had commanded. And Joseph provided food for his father and his brothers in amounts appropriate for the numbers of their dependents, including the smallest children. Meanwhile, now we've taken aside and we look at what's going on around this story of this family. Well, in the big picture, the famine had become so severe that all the food was used up. And the people were starving throughout the land of Egypt and Canaan. By selling grain to the people, Joseph had eventually collected all the money in Egypt and Canaan, and he put the money in Pharaoh's treasury. When the people of Egypt and Canaan ran out of money, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Our money is gone," they cried, "but please give us food or we will die before your very eyes." Joseph replied, "Since your money's gone, bring me your livestock. I will give you food in exchange for your livestock." So they brought their livestock to Joseph in exchange for food. In exchange for their horses, flocks of sheep and goats, herds, cattle and donkeys, Joseph provided them with food for another year. As an aside, looks like at that point, Pharaoh's going to need some shepherds to help with his big flocks. But back onto the scripture, that year ended, and the next year they came again and said, "We cannot hide the truth from you, my lord. Our money is gone, and all our livestock and cattle are yours. We have nothing left to give but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your very eyes? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We will offer our land and ourselves as slaves for Pharaoh. Just give us grain so that we may live and not die, and so the land does not become empty and desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sold him their fields because the famine was so severe, and soon all the land belonged to Pharaoh. As for the people, he made them all slaves from one end of Egypt to the other. And the only land he did not buy was the land belonging to the priests. They received an allotment of food directly from Pharaoh, so they didn't need to sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Look, today I bought you and your land for Pharaoh. I will provide you with seeds so you can plant the fields. Then when you harvest it, 1/5 of your crop will belong to Pharaoh, and you may keep the remaining 4/5 as seed for your fields and as food for you, your households, and your little ones." So we have, in effect, a tax of 20%, I guess, for the government now. "You have saved their lives, our lives," they exclaimed. "May it please you, my lord, to let us be Pharaoh's servants." Joseph then issued a decree still in effect in the land that Pharaoh should receive 1/5 of all the crops grown on his land. Only the land belonging to the priests was not given to Pharaoh. Meanwhile, now we're back. So that's what's going on in the big picture. Now we'll come back to our story of the family of Jacob. Meanwhile, the people of Israel or Jacob, same thing, settled in the region of Goshen in Egypt. There they acquired property, and they were fruitful, and their populations grew rapidly. A very different story for God's blessed people there. All right, so Pharaoh allowed Joseph's family to settle in the best part of the land of Egypt, where they were more than adequately cared for. But these native Egyptians had to pay dearly to sustain their very lives. As the famines remaining 5 years came and went, they got poorer and poorer and finally had to sell themselves into slavery to live. By that time, this famine ended and farming could begin again. Pharaoh owned everything. God had all the money, and all the people belonged to him, and all their property except for the priests. And the farmers had to pay this fifth of harvest to Pharaoh as an annual tax. Now, so not only had Jacob saved the nation from starvation, but he had also set up an economic system that enabled Pharaoh to control everything. And what were the people of Israel doing? Multiplying, just as God has promised. He said he was going to make a great nation out of Abraham's descendants, and he kept his promise. He worked in pagan Pharaoh's hearts and used him to care for Jacob and his family. Let's look quickly at Proverbs 21:1. The king's heart is like a stream of water directed by the Lord. He guides it wherever he pleases. I think many of us Christians today think that God can only use his own people. You have to be a Christian in a place of authority to be able for God's will to be done. But let's take heart when that doesn't happen. I think that's a good thing. We should strive to make it happen. But when it doesn't, take heart, because God can and does work his will even through unbelievers. Let's move on then to the last big section, which is a grandfather's inheritance. All right, so we'll look at Genesis 47:28 through 48:22 in sections here. We'll start by Jacob planning his burial. Well, so just to set the scene, Jacob had enjoyed being with Joseph for 17 years in Hebron. As a child, they were together, and now he would enjoy him and his sons for 17 years in Egypt. So kind of bookends there of his life where he was with Joseph. God had worked out his plan and cared for, at least for Jacob. Let's look at verses 47:28 through 31. Jacob lived for 17 years after his arrival in Egypt. So he lived 147 years in all. As the time of his death drew near, Jacob called for his son Joseph and said to him, "Please do me this favor. Put your hand under my thigh and swear that you will treat me with unfailing love by honoring this last request. Do not bury me in Egypt. When I die, please take my body out of Egypt and bury me with my ancestors." So Joseph promised, "I will do as you asked." "Swear that you will do it," Jacob insisted. So Joseph gave his oath, and Jacob bowed humbly at the head of his bed. Well, since Jacob had rejected Reuben, all right, Joseph was now performing the firstborn son's duties. He rejected Reuben because Reuben had slept with Bilhah. So now he was looking for Joseph to be doing the firstborn duties, and that included planning his father's burial. So Jacob wanted to be sure that he would be buried in the land that would one day be the home to his descendants. So that shows his strong trust in God, that he would he promised he would be, his descendants would be in the land of Canaan. There they all were now in Egypt, having a good time and thriving, but Jacob still had that trust, that faith that God eventually they would give them that land in Canaan. Jacob wanted his funeral to be a witness that he was not an idol worshiping Egyptian, but a believer in the true God. Our funeral and burial are the last public testimonies that we will give. Well, let's follow the example of Jacob and plan them to the glory of God. Next, we see Jacob and Joseph's two sons. One day, not long after this, word came to Joseph, your father is failing rapidly. So Joseph went to visit his father. He took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. When Joseph arrived, Jacob was told, your son Joseph has come to see you. So Jacob gathered his strength and sat up in his bed. Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me in Luz, in the land of Canaan. Luz is the same as Bethel, and blessed me. So he said to me, I will make you fruitful, and I will multiply your descendants. I will make you a multitude of nations, and I will give this land of Canaan to your descendants after you as an everlasting possession. Now I am claiming my own sons, these two boys of yours, Ephraim and Manasseh. Now I am claiming as my own two sons, your two boys, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born here in the land of Egypt before I arrived. They will be my sons, just as Reuben and Simeon are. But any children born to you in the future will be your own, and they will inherit land within the territories of their brothers, Ephraim and Manasseh. Okay. Well, I suppose Ephraim and Manasseh, I mean, it's been 17 years. So they're over 17. And they've known Joseph and, well, their father, but they've known Jacob, their grandfather, now for about 17 years. So he would know them. Long ago, when I was returning from Padam Aram, Rachel died in the land of Canaan. We were still on the way some distance from Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. So with great sorrow, I buried her there beside the road to Ephrath. Then Jacob looked over at the two boys. Are these your sons? He asked. Yes, Joseph told him. These are the sons God has given me here in Egypt. And Jacob said, bring them closer to me so I can bless them. So Jacob was half blind because of his age and could hardly see. So Joseph brought the boys close to him. Jacob kissed and embraced them. Then Jacob said to Joseph, I never thought I would see your face again, but now God has let me see your children too. Joseph moved the boys who were at their grandfather's knees as he bowed with his great face to the ground. Then he positioned the boys in front of Jacob, and with his right hand, he directed Ephraim toward Jacob's left hand. And with his left hand, he put Manasseh at Jacob's right hand. But Jacob crossed his arms as he reached out to lay hands on the boys' heads. He put his right hand on the head of Ephraim, though he was the younger boy, and his left hand on Manasseh, though he was the firstborn. Then he blessed and said, May the God before whom my grandfather Abraham and my father Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this very day, the angel who has redeemed me from all harm, may he bless these boys, and may they preserve my name and the names of Abraham and Isaac, and may their descendants multiply greatly throughout the earth. But Joseph was upset when he saw that his father placed his right hand on Ephraim's head. So Joseph lifted it to move it to Ephraim's head, from Ephraim's to Manasseh's head. No, my father, he said, this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. But his father refused. I know, my son, I know, he replied. Manasseh will also become a great nation, people, but his younger brother will become even greater, and his descendants will become a multitude of nations. So Jacob blessed the boys that day with this blessing. The people of Israel will use your name when they give a blessing. They will say, may God make you as prosperous as Ephraim and Manasseh. In this way, Jacob put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. Okay. Well, when Joseph walked into the room, Jacob somehow mustered enough strength to sit on the side of his bed and talk with his son, because it was just too important to delay. He didn't talk about how difficult his life had been. He spoke about God Almighty, and what he had done for his servant. His concern was to bless Joseph, whom he had made his firstborn, and then adopt Joseph's two sons as his own, making them sons of Israel. It's awesome to end your life knowing that you've completed God's business the way he wanted it done. And Jacob, through all his sins and mistakes, he did that. Jacob reviewed some of the experiences of his pilgrimage with God, beginning with the promises God had given him at Bethel, and including the death of his favorite wife, Rachel, Joseph's mother. So that's the context why Rachel came on, because Joseph was his mother. Jacob assured Joseph that God would multiply their number and one day take them out of Egypt into their own inheritance in the land of Canaan. Joseph's two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, would have an inheritance in that land because their grandfather was adopting them. So, as we've seen, Joseph replaced Reuben as firstborn, Jacob's firstborn, and now Joseph's sons would replace Simeon and Levi, Jacob's second and third sons. So in fact, the Levites were given no inheritance in the promised land, but lived in 44 cities scattered throughout Israel. And Simeon was this little nation that was right in the middle of, I'll show you next week, because we'll talk about this some more, but it was right in the middle of Judah, and got eventually absorbed into Judah, and you don't hear about him anymore by the end of Second Kings and Second Chronicles. Well, in this way, God punished Levi and Simeon for their anger and violence in Shechem. Recall, they were the two who went in there, and while the men of Shechem were recovering from circumcision, went and slaughtered everybody. Well, not only did Jacob adopt his two grandsons, but he also gave them a special blessing. Thus, for the fifth time in the book of Genesis, we see a reversal of birth order. God had chosen Abel, not Cain, Isaac, not Ishmael, Jacob, not Esau, Joseph, not Reuben, and now he would choose Ephraim over Manasseh. Joseph was upset. He was upset with what his father did and tried to change it, but God had guided Jacob's hands, and he kept it. He didn't budge. Well, in blessing Joseph's sons, Jacob also blessed Joseph, for the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh became strong leaders in Israel. Jacob gave all the glory to God, the God who had called his fathers and blessed them, shepherded him all his life, cared for him, saved him from evil and harm, even though he'd had all this difficulty in his life. So he gave all the glory to God. And then finally, this thing that I hadn't remembered till we went through this again, these final verses in Genesis chapter 48 here, 21 through 22, which are, then Jacob said to Joseph, look, I'm about to die, but God be with you and will be with you and will take you back to Canaan, the land of your ancestors. And beyond what I have given your brothers, I'm giving you an extra portion of the land that I took from the Amorites with my sword and my bow. So Joseph got this unexpected gift that day, a piece of land that Jacob had taken from the Amorites in battle. This is the only place it mentions that Jacob had any kind of wars with anybody his entire time in Canaan, but apparently he did with the Amorites, and so being the firstborn now, Jacob was eligible for a double portion of that blessing, and that also indicates that in the future kingdom, Joseph will have two portions of the land. This idea was reinforced when Joseph's sons, both received Jacob's blessing, effectively giving Joseph a double blessing through his sons. So Jacob had blessed Joseph's sons, and now it was time for him to prophesy about all of his sons, which we will witness in next week's lesson in the next chapter. So, to summarize and end the session, Jacob's entire family immigrated to Egypt. Pharaoh welcomed them with open arms. Joseph's family met their relatives for the first time. And then Pharaoh and Jacob chat, and Jacob blesses Pharaoh. Jacob adopts his grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Jacob gives his blessing to Ephraim instead of his main blessing to Ephraim, and then Jacob gives the land of Canaan, land in Canaan, not the entire land, but a piece of land in Canaan to Joseph. Next week we're going to continue this, and we'll see Jacob assess all of his sons and accurately predict the future outcomes of their descendants. Their descendants are the nation of Israel and all the tribes. So we'll see that Jacob is able to predict a lot of things about how the tribes turned out. All right, any comments or questions? What was that?
I just asked Janet if she had anything.
Okay.
I think it's interesting that there still winds up being 12 tribes in Israel, with Joseph's sons being 2 tribes, and the Levites not actually inheriting anything because they lived in the cities. So there still winds up being 12 tribes.
Yeah. And then I'd never thought about Simeon being absorbed like that as a punishment, until Wiersbe pointed that out in this lesson. And so, so we have 12 tribes, but it's not a strict mapping from all the 12 children of Israel or Jacob down to them. Yeah. We get the double portion for Joseph's through his sons, and nothing for Levi. Yeah. And that there was the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. When they split, the southern kingdom was called Judah, even though it included everything south of there, which included the tribe of Simeon there,
and Benjamin.
and Benjamin, although sometimes in the years after, sometimes parts of Benjamin were kind of siding with the northern kingdom, but overall, I guess Benjamin was part of it too. Of course, they'd been wiped out earlier, so they weren't such a big tribe. Back in the some of the worst scenes in the book of Judges, when the other tribe killed most of the tribe of Benjamin, was kind of a low point in the whole history of Israel, I think there.
Yep.
But yes, Benjamin and Judah. Tomorrow we're going to go through, next week we'll go through all of these tribes one by one. It's interesting. And I like that last chapter of the blessings, and trying to understand what Jacob means with each one. About each blessing there. All right. Well, anything else today? I'll stop the recording and